Arthur Conan Doyle, The Resident Patient. While turning over the rather disjointed notes with which I have attempted to illustrate the peculiarities of my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes's mind, I was struck by the difficulty of selecting examples that would fully serve my purpose. For in those cases where Holmes employed some truly remarkable feat of analytical reasoning and demonstrated the value of his special methods of investigation, the facts themselves were often so slight and commonplace that I felt scarcely justified in publishing them. On the other hand, it frequently happened that he was engaged in inquiries of a striking and dramatic nature, yet the part played by Holmes in their solution was less prominent than I, as his biographer, could have wished. The little affair which I have recorded under the title A Study in Scarlet, and another, of later date, connected with the disappearance of the Gloria Scott, may serve as examples of those very Scyllas and Charybdis which eternally threaten the historian. Perhaps the role played by my friend in the case I am about to describe is not particularly conspicuous. Nevertheless, the circumstances of the affair are so remarkable that I cannot allow myself to omit it from my records. It was a close, overcast day in October, though toward evening the air grew cooler. "What do you say to a stroll through London, Watson?" said my friend. It was impossible to remain in our small sitting room, and I readily agreed. For some 3 hours we wandered along Fleet Street and the Strand, watching the kaleidoscope of street life. Conversation with Holmes, always keenly observant and lavish in shrewd remarks, was, as ever, absorbing. We returned to Baker Street at about 10 o'clock. A carriage was standing before the door. "H.M. A doctor's carriage," said Holmes. "He has not been in practice very long, yet he already has many patients. I presume he has come to ask our advice. How fortunate that we have returned." I was sufficiently familiar with Holmes's deductive methods to follow the train of his reasoning. A single glance into the wicker bag hanging in the carriage and lit by the street lamp was enough for him to determine, from the nature and condition of the medical instruments, to whom the carriage belonged. And the light shining in the window of one of our second-floor rooms showed that this late visitor had come to us. Curious to learn what could have brought a fellow medical man at so late an hour, I followed Holmes into our consulting room. As we entered, a pale, narrow-faced man with reddish side whiskers rose from a chair by the fireplace. He could not have been more than 33 or 34, yet he looked older. From his dull, sallow complexion, it was clear that life had dealt him few favors. Like all sensitive natures, he was at once impulsive and shy, and his thin white hand, with which he grasped the mantelpiece as he rose, seemed more the hand of an artist than of a surgeon. He was dressed quietly, a black frock coat, dark trousers, and a colored but modest tie. "Good evening, doctor," said Holmes pleasantly. "I am glad you were obliged to wait only a few minutes." "Did you speak with my coachman?" asked our visitor. "No. I inferred it from the candle standing on the table. Pray sit down and tell me how I may be of service." "My name is Dr. Percy Trevelyan," said the visitor. "I live at number 403 Brook Street. Are you not the author of a monograph on rare nervous diseases?" I asked. At hearing that I was acquainted with his book, a flush of pleasure rose to his pale cheeks. "That work is so seldom cited that I had quite buried it," he said. "My publishers told me it was selling disastrously badly. You yourself, I presume, are also a medical man." "A retired army surgeon. I have always been deeply interested in nervous disorders and should like to specialize in them, but one must be content with circumstances. However, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, that is not to the point, and I fully understand that your time is extremely valuable. For some time past, very strange things have been happening in my house in Brook Street. And this evening matters took such a turn that I could not wait an hour longer and was compelled to come to you to ask for your advice and assistance." Sherlock Holmes seated himself and lit his pipe. "Command me," he said. "Tell me in detail what has alarmed you." "Mere trifles," said Dr. Trevelyan. "I am almost ashamed to mention them. Yet they have greatly perplexed me, and the last incident is such that I had better relate everything in order, leaving it to you to decide what is important and what is not. I must begin with my student days. You see, I graduated from the University of London, and, without wishing to sing my own praises, my professors had high hopes of me. After leaving the university, I did not abandon research work, but remained in a modest post at the clinic attached to King's College. I was fortunate enough to draw some attention to my research on rare cases of catalepsy, eventually winning the Bruce Pinkerton Prize and a medal for my monograph on nervous diseases, the very one your friend just mentioned. It is no exaggeration to say that, at the time, everyone predicted a brilliant future for me. There was, however, one obstacle. I was poor. It is easy to understand my position. A specialist who aims high must begin his career on one of the streets choice abutting Cavendish Square, where the cost of renting and furnishing a house is astronomical. Quite apart from these overheads, one must find the means to live for several years and maintain a respectable carriage. All this was far beyond my reach, and I had resigned myself to a life of thrift, hoping to save enough to start a private practice in 10 years' time. Then, quite suddenly, chance intervened. One morning, a complete stranger by the name of Mr. Blessington walked into my room and came straight to the point. "Are you the same Percy Trevelyan who recently won that prize for distinguished merit?" he asked. I bowed. "Answer me plainly," he continued, "for it is in your own interest. You have the brains to succeed, but what about the tact?" I could not help but smile at such an unexpected question. I trust one am not entirely lacking in that quality. "Have you any bad habits? Do you drink?" "Good heavens, sir!" I exclaimed. "Very well, then. That is settled. But I was bound to ask, how is it that a man with your head is not in practice?" I shrugged my shoulders. "Come now," he said with his characteristic briskness. "It's the old story. You have more in your head than in your pocket. Is that not so? What would you say if I were to help you set up on Brook Street to start with?" I stared at him in amazement. "Oh, I do it for my own profit, not yours," he said. "To be frank, if it suits you, it certainly suits me. You see, I have a few £1,000s to spare, and I have a mind to invest that capital in you." "But why?" I could barely stammer. "Well, it's as good a business venture as any other, and far safer." "And what must I do?" "I shall explain. I will take the house, furnish it, and pay the servants. In short, I shall manage everything. You have only to sit in your consulting room. I will provide you with pocket money and all the rest. You will give me 3/4 of your earnings and keep the remainder for yourself." Such was the singular proposal, Mr. Holmes, that Mr. Blessington made to me. I will not tax your patience by recounting the details of our negotiations. By Lady Day, I had moved in and begun seeing patients, settling accounts with Mr. Blessington on much the same terms as he had proposed. He took up residence in the house himself, becoming something of a resident patient living beside the doctor's consulting room. It turned out he had a weak heart and required constant supervision. He occupied the 2 best rooms on the 2nd floor as his own sitting room and bedroom. His habits were peculiar. He shunned society and very rarely went out. Though not particularly punctual in other matters, he was the soul of regularity in one. Every evening, at the same hour, he would enter my room, examine the day book, set aside 5 shillings and 3 pence from every guinea I had earned, and take the rest of the money to a chest kept in his room. I must tell you frankly that he never had cause to regret his investment. From the very beginning, the venture proved lucrative. My early successes and the reputation I had earned at the hospital allowed me to rise quickly, and over the last 2 years, I have made him a wealthy man. Such, Mr. Holmes, is my history and my connection with Mr. Blessington. It only remains for me to tell you the events that have brought me here tonight. A few weeks ago, Mr. Blessington entered my room in a state of great agitation. He spoke of some burglary which, he said, had been committed in the West End. This, as I recall, unsettled him deeply, and he insisted that we put additional bars on the doors and windows without a day's delay. For a week, he remained in a state of terrible anxiety, constantly peering out of the windows and abandoning the short walks he usually took before dinner. Watching his behavior, it occurred to me that he was in mortal fear of something or someone, but when I questioned him directly, he became so abusive that I was forced to drop the subject. In time, his fears seemed to fade, and he was beginning to return his old habits when a new event threw him into such a state that it was pitiable to behold. He remains in that state to this day. And this is what happened. 2 days ago, I received a letter which I shall now read to you. It bears neither a return address nor a postmark. A Russian nobleman, now resident in England, it says, would be most grateful if Dr. Percy Trevelyan would consent to see him. For several years he has suffered from fits of catalepsy, and, as is well known, Dr. Trevelyan is an authority on this disease. He proposes to call tomorrow at 6:15 in the evening if Dr. Trevelyan finds it convenient to be at home at that hour. The letter interested me, as catalepsy is a very rare condition. At the appointed hour, I was in my consulting room. The servant showed the patient in. He was an elderly man, thin, grave, and of the most commonplace appearance. I had imagined a Russian nobleman quite differently. I was far more struck by the appearance of his companion, a tall young man, remarkably handsome, with a dark, fierce face and the limbs and chest of a Hercules. He supported his companion by the elbow and helped him into a chair with a tenderness one would hardly have expected from a man of his build. "Pardon me, doctor, for entering also," he said to me in English, though with a slight lisp. "This is my father, and his health is everything to me." I was touched by this filial devotion. "Perhaps you would like to remain with your father during the consultation?" I asked. "Heaven forbid!" he cried, throwing up his hands in horror. "I cannot tell you how painful it is for me to watch him. If he should have one of his terrible fits, I should not survive it. I have an exceptionally sensitive nervous system myself. With your permission," the young man said, "I shall wait in the consulting room while you attend to my father." I agreed, of course, and the young man withdrew. I began to question the patient about his ailment and took diligent notes. He was not a man of great intellect, and his replies were often vague, which I attributed to his poor command of the language. Suddenly, he ceased responding to my questions altogether. Turning toward him, I was astonished to see him sitting bolt upright in his chair, his face rigid, staring at me with a vacant, fixed gaze. He had succumbed to another fit of his mysterious malady. My first impulse was one of pity and alarm. However, I must confess with some shame that professional curiosity soon took the upper hand. I recorded my patient's temperature and pulse, tested the rigidity of his muscles, and examined his reflexes. Everything corresponded perfectly with my previous observations. In such cases, I had achieved excellent results through the inhalation of nitrite of amyl, and it struck me as a providential opportunity to test the efficacy of the drug once more. The bottle was in my laboratory on the ground floor. Leaving my patient in the chair, I hurried down to fetch it. I was delayed for a moment searching for the vial and returned, I should say, in about 5 minutes. Imagine my amazement when I found the room empty and my patient gone without a trace. Naturally, my first move was to rush into the waiting room. The son had also departed. The hall door was closed, but not locked. My page, who admits the patients, is new to the work and by no means quick-witted. He waits below and runs up to show patients out only when I ring for my consulting room. He had heard nothing, and the entire matter remained an absolute enigma to me. A short while later, Mr. Blessington returned from his walk. I told him nothing, for lately, to tell the truth, I have endeavored to communicate with him as little as possible. I never imagined I should see the Russian and his son again, and you may therefore conceive my surprise when both appeared in my consulting room at the same hour this evening. I must earnestly beg your pardon for my abrupt departure yesterday, Doctor, said my patient. I confess I was greatly surprised, I replied. The fact is, he explained, that when I recover from these fits, I have almost no memory of what preceded them. I awoke, as it seemed to me, in a strange room, and in my confusion, I hastened out into the street. And I, added the son, seeing my father pass through the waiting room, naturally assumed that the consultation was over. It was only when we reached home that I began to realize what had happened. Well, I said with a laugh, no harm is done, though you certainly gave me a riddle to solve. Now, sir, will you be so good as to step into the waiting room while I attend to your father once more? For about half an hour, the old gentleman described his symptoms to me, after which, having written a prescription, I saw him out to his son. I have already mentioned that this was the hour Mr. Blessington usually took his walk. Soon after, he returned and went upstairs. Immediately, I heard him rushing back down. He burst into my consulting room in a state of blind panic. "Who has been into my room?" he cried. "No one," I replied. "You lie," he shrieked. "Come up and see for yourself." I chose to ignore his rudeness, for he was quite beside himself with terror. We went upstairs, and he pointed to the footprints impressed upon the thick pile of the carpet. "Do you think those are mine?" he shouted. They were certainly far too large to be his, and they were clearly fresh. As you know, there was a heavy downpour this afternoon, and the only visitors I had received were the father and son. It followed that while I was occupied with the father, the son, waiting in the reception room, had, for some purpose unknown to me, entered the chamber of my resident patient. Nothing had been stolen from the room, yet the footprints were undeniable evidence of an intruder. It seemed to me that Mr. Blessington was agitated beyond all reason, and yet such an incident would be enough to unsettle anyone. Sinking into a chair, he actually began to sob, and it was only with great effort that I managed to compose him. It was he who suggested that I come to you, and I thought the proposal most sound, for the incident is indeed very strange, though perhaps not quite so terrible as Mr. Blessington's imagination paints it. If you would come back with me now, you might at least succeed in quieting him, though, in my opinion, he is hardly able to explain what has so thoroughly alarmed him. Sherlock Holmes had listened to this long narrative with great attention, and I could see that the case had piqued his interest. As was his wont, his face remained expressionless. Only his eyelids seemed a little heavy, and as he puffed at his pipe, he sent out thicker clouds of smoke whenever the doctor reached a particularly curious point in his story. The moment our visitor finished speaking, Holmes sprang up in silence, handed me my hat, took his own from the table, and followed Trevelyan to the door. In less than a quarter of an hour, We reached the doctor's house in Brook Street. It was a modest, unremarkable house, typical of the West End practitioners. The page boy opened the door, and we immediately began to ascend the broad, well-carpeted staircase. But then a singular thing happened. The light above was suddenly extinguished, and from the darkness came a shrill, quivering voice. "I have a pistol. One step further, and I shall fire." "This is really going too far, Mr. Blessington," cried Dr. Trevelyan indignantly. "Oh, is it you, Doctor?" said the voice from the darkness with a great sigh of relief. "And the gentlemen with you, are they truly who they represent themselves to be?" We felt that we were being scrutinized by unseen eyes in the gloom. "Yes, they are the gentlemen." "Very well, you may come up. And if my precautions have annoyed you, I ask your pardon." As he spoke, he relit the gas on the landing, and we saw before us a singular-looking man whose appearance, like his voice, bore witness to shattered nerves. He was very stout, but had evidently been much stouter, for the skin hung in great folds about his cheeks like those of a bloodhound. He was of a sickly pallor, and his thin, reddish hair stood almost on end from the terror he had endured. His hand gripped a pistol, which he thrust into his pocket as we approached. "Good evening, Mr. Holmes," said he. "I thank you most sincerely for coming. No one ever stood in greater need of your advice than I do now. I suppose Dr. Trevelyan has already told you of this most unpardonable intrusion into my room?" "Precisely," said Sherlock Holmes. "Now, Mr. Blessington, who are these two men, and why do they trouble you?" "You see, well, the fact is, the resident patient stammered in a flurried manner. It is difficult for me to say anything definite." "How should I know, Mr. Holmes?" "You do not know, then? Pray come in. Come in, I beg of you." He led us into his bedroom, a large and comfortably furnished apartment. "Do you see that?" he asked, pointing to a large black chest at the foot of his bed. "I have never been a particularly wealthy man, Mr. Holmes. I have only once in my life invested my money in a business venture. Dr. Trevelyan here can bear me out. I do not trust bankers. I would not trust a banker with my money for anything in the world, Mr. Holmes. Between ourselves, my entire little fortune is kept in that chest, and you can understand now what I felt when strangers forced their way into my room." Holmes looked searchingly at Blessington and shook his head. "If you try to deceive me," he said, "I can give you no counsel. But I have told you everything." With an impatient toss of his hand, Holmes turned abruptly on his heel. "Good night, Dr. Trevelyan," said he. "And you have no advice for me?" Blessington cried in a trembling voice. "My advice to you, sir, is to speak only the truth." A minute later, we were out in the street and walking homeward. We had crossed Oxford Street and traversed half of Harley Street before my friend finally spoke. "I am sorry to have brought you out on a fool's errand, Watson. And yet, if one looks closely, it is a curious case." "I confess I see nothing very serious in it," I admitted. "It is quite obvious that two men, perhaps more, but let us say two, have for some reason determined to get at this man Blessington. I have no doubt in my own mind that on both the first and the second occasion, the young man entered Blessington's room, while his confederate distracted the doctor by a very simple device. And the catalepsy? A gross simulation, Watson, though I did not wish to say so to our specialist. It is a very easy disease to feign. I have practiced it myself. What happened then? By pure chance, Blessington was out on both occasions. They chose such an unusual hour for their visit only because there are no other patients in the waiting room at that time, but happened to coincide with the hour of Blessington's constitutional. They are evidently not perfectly acquainted with his habits. Of course, if simple robbery had been their object, they would at least have attempted to ransack the room. Furthermore, I read in the man's eyes that he is frightened to the very marrow of his bones. It is difficult to believe that a man with two such vindictive enemies knows nothing of their existence. He knows perfectly well who they are, but for reasons of his own, he chooses to conceal it. It is possible that by tomorrow he may be more communicative. Is there not another alternative? I suggested, one that is no doubt highly improbable, but still plausible. Might Dr. Trevelyan himself have invented this story of the Russian cataleptic and his son as a pretext to enter Blessington's room? By the light of the gas lamp, I saw that my brilliant theory had brought a smile to Holmes's lips. "My dear Watson," said he, "it was the first thought that occurred to me, but the doctor's story is corroborated. The young man left footprints not only in the room, but also upon the stair carpet. The young man exists. He wears square-toed boots, whereas Blessington's are pointed, and they are a good inch and a third longer than the doctor's own. And now, straight to bed, for I shall be surprised if we do not have news from Brook Street in the morning." Sherlock Holmes's prophecy was fulfilled, and the news was tragic. At 7:30 in the morning, while the somber day was still breaking, Holmes stood by my bedside in his dressing gown. "Watson," he said, "there is a carriage waiting." "What is it, then?" "The Brook Street business." "Is there news?" "Tragic, but somewhat vague," he said, pulling up the blind. "Look at this." It is a leaf from a notebook with these words scrawled in pencil: "For God's sake, come at once. P.T. Our friend the doctor seems to have lost his head. Make haste, my dear Watson, for we are urgently expected." In about a quarter of an hour, we reached the doctor's house. He rushed out to meet us, his face distorted with horror. "Such a calamity!" he cried, pressing his hands to his temples. "What has happened?" "Blessington has committed suicide." Holmes whistled. "Yes, he hanged himself during the night." We entered, and the doctor led us into the room which served as his surgery. "I hardly know what I am doing," he said. "The police are already upstairs. I am shaken to my very soul. When did you discover it?" He was brought a cup of tea early every morning. The maid entered at about 7 o'clock, and the unfortunate man was already hanging in the center of the room. He had fastened a cord to the hook from which the heavy lamp usually hangs, and had jumped from the very chest he showed us yesterday. Holmes stood lost in deep thought. "With your permission," he said at last, "I should like to go upstairs and see for myself." Accompanied by the doctor, we both went up. Behind the bedroom door, a ghastly sight awaited us. I have already mentioned the impression of flabbiness which Blessington produced. Now, as he hung from the hook, that impression was intensified. There was hardly anything human left in his face. His neck was elongated like that of a plucked chicken, and by contrast, his body appeared even more portly and unnatural. He wore only a long nightshirt, from beneath which his swollen ankles and ungainly feet protruded stiffly. Standing nearby was a dapper inspector, making notes in a pocketbook. "Ah, Mr. Holmes," he said as my friend entered, "I am glad to see you." "Good morning, Lanner," Holmes replied. "I hope you do not object to my intrusion. Have you heard of the events which preceded this affair?" "Yes, I have heard something of them." "And what is your opinion?" "As far as I can judge, the man was driven mad by fear. Look at the bed. He has had a restless night. There's a deep impression of his body here. You know that suicides are most commonly committed around 5 in the morning. That is approximately the time he hanged himself. He had evidently thought it all out beforehand. From the rigidity of the muscles, I should say he has been dead for about 3 hours," I remarked. "Has anything of particular interest been discovered in the room?" asked Holmes. "We found a screwdriver and several screws on the washstand," Inspector Lanner replied. "And there was evidently a great deal of smoking here during the night. I picked up these 4 cigar ends from the fireplace." Said Holmes. "Did you find a cigar holder?" "No." "And his cigar case?" "Yes, it was in his coat pocket." Holmes opened the case and sniffed the single cigar remaining inside. "This is a Havana," he said, "but these remnants are of a peculiar sort of cigar imported by the Dutch from their East Indian colonies. They're usually wrapped in straw, as you know, and are thinner and longer than other varieties." He took the 4 cigar ends and examined them through his pocket lens. "2 were smoked through a holder and 2 without," he continued. "2 were cut with a somewhat blunt knife, and the tips of the other 2 were bitten off by a magnificent set of teeth. This is no suicide, Inspector Lanner. This is a very deeply planned and cold-blooded murder." "Impossible!" cried the inspector. "And why impossible? Why should anyone murder a man in so clumsy a fashion as hanging him? That is what we have to find out. How could they have entered?" "Through the front door. But it was barred on the inside. It was barred after they entered." "How do you know that?" "I saw the marks. If you will allow me, I may be able to give you a few more details in a moment." He walked to the door and, turning the key in the lock, examined it with his customary methodical care. He then pulled out the key, which had been in the inner side, and inspected that as well. The bed, the carpet, the chairs, the mantelpiece, the body, and the rope, each was scrutinized in turn, until at last Holmes declared himself satisfied. With the assistance of the inspector and myself, he cut down the rope from which the unfortunate Blessington hung and respectfully covered the remains with a sheet. "Where did the rope come from?" I asked. "It was cut from this," said Dr. Trevelyan, pulling a large coil of rope from under the bed. "He was possessed by a terrible fear of fire and always kept this at hand so that he might escape by the window if the stairs were ablaze." "That must have saved the murderers a world of trouble," Holmes remarked thoughtfully. "Yes, it has been a very simple matter, and I shall be surprised if by noon I cannot give you the reasons for the crime. I shall take this photograph of Blessington, which stands upon the mantelpiece. It may aid me in my inquiries." "But for heaven's sake, tell us what has happened," the doctor pleaded. "The sequence of events is as clear to me as if I had been present," said Holmes. "There were 3 of them, 1 young, 1 old, and a third whose character I have not yet determined. It is hardly necessary to say that the first 2 are the same who posed as the Russian nobleman and his son, and consequently we have their full descriptions. They were admitted by a confederate inside the house. If I may offer a word of advice, Inspector, you should arrest the page boy, who, if I remember correctly, has only recently entered your service, Doctor." "The young scoundrel is nowhere to be found," said Dr. Trevelyan. "The maid and the cook have been searching for him." Holmes shrugged his shoulders. "He has played a significant part in this drama," said he. The 3 men ascended the stairs on tiptoe, the elder man first, the younger second, and the unknown man bringing up the rear. "My dear Holmes, this is surely going too far," I exclaimed. "From the way the footprints overlap, there can be no doubt. I had the opportunity to study whose tracks were whose when I was here last evening." The 3 then approached Mr. Blessington's room, the door of which was locked. They turned the key by means of a piece of wire. Even without a lens, the scratches upon the ward of the lock show where they used the nippers. Upon entering, their first act was to gag Mr. Blessington. He was probably asleep, or perhaps so paralyzed by terror that he could not cry out. The walls here are thick, and it is certain that his scream, even if he had time to utter one, was heard by no one. Then, and this is perfectly clear, The intruders held a council, a sort of trial. It was then that they smoked these cigars. The elder man sat in that wicker chair. It was he who used the holder. The younger sat there. He brushed his ash onto the chest of drawers. The third paced the room. Blessington, I believe, sat upon the bed, though that I am not quite so certain. And then it ended by their hanging him. They had come so well prepared that they had even brought a block and pulley with them to serve as a gallows. That screwdriver and the screws were intended, I imagine, to fix the pulley. But seeing the hook, they naturally made use of it. When their work was done, they withdrew, and their confederate locked the door behind them. We had all listened with profound interest to this account of the night's events, which Holmes had reconstructed from signs so subtle and insignificant that, even while seeing them, we could scarcely follow the train of his reasoning. The inspector hurried out at once to take measures for the pursuit of the page, while Holmes and I returned to Baker Street for breakfast. "I shall be back by 3 o'clock," he said when we had finished. "The inspector and the doctor will be here by then, and I hope to make everything clear to them." Our guests arrived at the appointed time, but my friend did not appear until 3:45. However, the moment he entered, the expression on his face told me that his efforts had been crowned with success. "What news, Inspector?" "We have found the boys, sir." "Excellent. And I have found the men." "You have found them?" we cried in one breath. "Well, at least I have found out who they are. Your Blessington, as I expected, is well known at police headquarters. So are his murderers. They are Biddle, Hayward, and Moffat, the gang that robbed the Worthington Bank," exclaimed the inspector. "Precisely," said Holmes. "Then Blessington must have been Sutton." "Exactly," said Holmes. "Well, that makes everything clear," the inspector remarked. But Trevelyan and I looked at each other, still utterly mystified. "You will remember the famous Worthington Bank robbery," said Holmes. "There were 5 in the gang, for we have accounted for, and the 5th was named Cartwright. Tobin, the caretaker, was murdered, and the thieves got away with £7,000. That was in 1875. All 5 were arrested, but the evidence against them was far from conclusive. Blessington, or Sutton, the worst of the lot, turned informer. On his evidence, Cartwright was hanged, while the other 3 received 15 years apiece. Having been released a few years before the full expiration of their sentences, they made it their first business, as you may imagine, to track down the traitor and avenge the death of their comrade. Twice they attempted to reach him and failed. The 3rd time, as you see, they succeeded. Is it all clear to you now, Dr. Trevelyan? "I did not think it could be made clearer," said the doctor. "And of course, that first fit of agitation must have occurred on the very day he read in the papers that they had been set free." "Precisely. All his talk of fear of burglars was merely a blind to cover the truth." "But why did he not tell you the whole truth?" "Well, my dear sir, he knew the vindictive character of his former associates, and he sought to conceal his identity for as long as possible. It was a shameful secret, and he could not bring himself to confess it to me. However, no matter how great a scoundrel he may have been, he lived under the protection of British law, and I have no doubt, Inspector, that you will take the necessary measures. The shield of justice failed him this time, but its sword must still be ready to strike. Such are the singular circumstances connected with the case of the resident patient and the Brook Street doctor. The police never succeeded in capturing the murderers, and it was believed at Scotland Yard that they were among the passengers of the ill-fated steamer Nora Crana, which was lost with all hands some years ago off the Portuguese coast, a few leagues north of Oporto. The case against the page boy was dismissed for want of sufficient evidence, and to this day, The Brook Street mystery has never been fully chronicled in the public press.